I spent 3 years building an empire alongside the man I thought was my soulmate, only for him to hand me a severance check and replace me with a flawless Omega. 5 years later, he's staring in absolute horror at the fresh, permanent bite mark on my neck left by his worst enemy. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our shared penthouse, blurring the glittering skyline of the city we had conquered together. I stood in the center of the living room, a mug of chamomile tea growing cold in my hands, staring at the man I had loved for 3 grueling, transformative years. His name was Damien Harrington. When I first met him, he was a marginalized alpha in a cutthroat corporate dynasty, struggling to prove his worth to a board of directors who viewed him as too soft. I was the one who sharpened his edges. As an Omega, with a background in corporate strategy, a rarity that most traditionalists scoffed at, I spent countless sleepless nights drafting his proposals, managing his public relations, and soothing his rut-induced fevers. My scent, a sharp blend of cedar and petrichor, was unconventional for an Omega, but Damien used to bury his face in my neck and tell me it was the only thing that kept him grounded. That was a lie, of course. "It's not about us, Leo," Damien said, his voice meticulously, even as if he were reading a quarterly earnings report. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was busy adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit. "It's about the Harrington legacy. You know the board's stance. You know my father's expectations." "Your father's expectations," I repeated the words, tasting like ash on my tongue. "For 3 years, your father's expectations didn't matter, when I was the one pulling your division out of bankruptcy, when I was the one who negotiated the merger with the European branch." Damien finally looked up, his jaw tight. His scent, a usually comforting wash of oak moss and amber, had turned sour defensive. "You're a brilliant strategist, Leo. No one is denying that. But you're not. You're not what the family needs for the public face of the company. Say it," I demanded, my voice trembling, despite my desperate attempt to keep it level. My inner Omega was writhing in agony, feeling the violent snapping of the proto-bond we had cultivated. "Say exactly what I am not." He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Caleb Montgomery." The name hit me like a physical blow. Caleb Montgomery. He was the darling of the city's elite, a 21-year-old Omega from a legacy family who smelled like vanilla and peach blossoms. He had never worked a day in his life, spent his time organizing charity galas, and possessed a pedigree so pristine it was almost suffocating. He was, by all societal standards, a pure Omega, unblemished, docile, and perfectly ornamental. "The Montgomery family has agreed to a union," Damien continued, stepping toward the mahogany coffee table. He picked up a thick manila envelope and slid it towards me. "The engagement will be announced on Friday. My father requires a clean slate. I've had my lawyers draft a separation agreement. There's a $2 million severance, a luxury condo downtown, and a non-disclosure agreement. You'll be set for life, Leo." I stared at the envelope. He was paying me off. 3 years of devotion. 3 years of building his throne, reduced to a hush-money payout, so he could stand beside a porcelain doll who smelled like dessert. "A severance," I whispered. A bitter, broken laugh escaped my throat. "You're firing me from our relationship. I am securing my future as the CEO of Harrington Industries." Damien snapped a flash of alpha dominance, bleeding into his tone, trying to submit me into compliance. In the past, that tone would have made me bare my neck in an instant. Now it just made my stomach turn. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. You always knew my family would never accept an Omega who clawed his way up from the outer boroughs. You have scars, Leo. You're aggressive. You don't yield. You're a partner, but you're not a wife." The silence that followed was deafening. The sheer audacity of his cowardice stripped away the last remnants of my heartbreak, leaving behind a cold, crystallizing rage. I set my mug down on the table right next to the envelope. "You're right," I said quietly, looking him dead in the eye. "I don't yield." I didn't take the envelope. I didn't pack a bag. I walked into the bedroom, put on my coat, picked up my briefcase containing my personal laptop, and walked out the front door. Damien called after me, his voice pitching with a strange mixture of relief and panic, but I didn't look back. I stepped into the elevator, and as the doors slid shut, the first tear finally fell. I was 24 years old, unbonded, abruptly unemployed, and entirely alone. But as I walked out into the freezing rain, shivering in my thin trench coat, I made a silent vow to the universe. Damien Harrington had traded me for a decorative piece of glass. I was going to make sure he spent the rest of his life watching me shine like a diamond he could no longer afford. 5 years is a long time in the corporate underworld. It took 2 years of eating instant ramen in a studio apartment and taking on freelance crisis management gigs for D-list corporations before I caught my real break. I rebranded myself entirely. I suppressed my Omega nature with military-grade inhibitors, blocking my scent entirely, and marketed myself as the most ruthless fixer in the city. If a CEO was caught in a scandal, if a hostile takeover was getting messy, they called Leo Hayes. By the time I was 29, I was a partner at a boutique firm, wearing suits that cost more than my first car, and operating with a heart encased in solid ice. I had watched from the sidelines as Damien married Caleb in the wedding of the decade. I watched Caleb smile demurely on the covers of magazines, while Damien took over Harrington Industries. They looked perfect. They looked nauseating. But perfection breeds complacency. Harrington Industries grew stagnant, bloated by Damien's cautious leadership. And nature abhors a vacuum. Enter Victor. Victor was a force of nature. He was an alpha who had built a rival conglomerate from the ground up, dominating the tech and logistics sectors with a terrifying predatory grace. He was notoriously reclusive, entirely unpredictable, and Damien Harrington's absolute worst nightmare. For 3 years, Victor had been slowly bleeding Harrington Industries, dry-out maneuvering Damien at every single turn. I never expected our paths to cross until the night my firm's managing partner dropped a heavily redacted file on my desk. "Victor wants you," my boss said, looking slightly pale. "Specifically you. He's dealing with a massive corporate espionage leak, and he refuses to work with anyone else." Walking into Victor's headquarters the next day felt like stepping into the belly of a beast. The architecture was all brutalist concrete and dark glass, a stark contrast to the golden, ostentatious halls of Harrington Industries. I was ushered into a massive corner office that smelled strongly of dark roast coffee, old paper, and a sharp, crackling ozone like the air right before a violent thunderstorm. Victor was standing by the window. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a simple tailored black button-down, with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faintly dusted with ink. When he turned around, my breath hitched. He had piercing, pale grey eyes that seemed to strip away every layer of armor I had meticulously built. "Leo Hayes," Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "I've read your dossiers. You're brilliant, you're utterly merciless, and you hate Damien Harrington almost as much as I do." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my posture rigid. "I don't mix personal feelings with business, Mr. Victor. I am here to patch a leak in your R&D department, nothing more." A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. Of course, but shared enemies make for excellent bedfellows, don't they? Working with Victor was an adrenaline rush. Unlike Damien, who had always needed me to soften his image and manage his insecurities, Victor needed no such coddling. He was sharp, decisive, and demanded excellence. We spent weeks holed up in his office, tracing the espionage leak back to a shell company, funded by, unsurprisingly, a desperate Harrington Industries. It was during our 4th week of late-night strategy sessions that the armor finally cracked. It was past 2 a.m. We were leaning over a sprawling schematic of offshore accounts. I was exhausted, running on black coffee and sheer spite. What I hadn't realized was that my stress levels were burning through my scent blockers faster than usual. Suddenly, Victor went completely still. His hand, which had been pointing at a document, hovered in the air. He turned his head slowly, his grey eyes darkening to the colour of storm clouds. He inhaled deeply, a harsh, ragged sound in the quiet office. "Cedar," he murmured, his voice dropping a full octave rough with sudden alpha instinct. And rain. Panic spiked in my chest. I scrambled back, hitting the edge of a mahogany bookshelf. My blockers. They must have worn off. I'll go take a dose right now." Before I could move, Victor crossed the room in 2 long strides. He didn't touch me, but he boxed me in, planting his hands on the shelf on either side of my head. His sheer physical presence was overwhelming, drowning my senses in the heavy scent of ozone and lightning. I braced myself for the disgust. I braced myself for the typical alpha reaction, the demand to know why I wasn't smelling like vanilla or roses, why my scent was so sharp and defensive. Instead, Victor leaned in, hovering just inches from my neck. He closed his eyes and breathed me in, a look of profound, terrifying reverence crossing his harsh features. "Don't," he commanded softly. "Don't you dare suppress it. Not in here." "I'm an Omega," I whispered, hating how vulnerable I sounded. I'm not the kind of Omega you want in your boardroom or anywhere else." Victor opened his eyes, and the fierce intensity in them stole the air from my lungs. "You think I want a docile, sweet-smelling decoration? I know who you are, Leo. I know what Harrington did to you. He was a blind, cowardly fool who held a weapon forged in fire and discarded it because he was afraid it would burn him." Victor finally lifted a hand, his large, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. "I'm not afraid of the fire, Leo. That night changed everything. The professional boundaries shattered, replaced by an intoxicating, all-consuming dynamic. Victor didn't just want my body. He worshipped my mind. He involved me in every high-level decision, trusting my instincts implicitly. When my pre-rut hit a month later, it was fierce and agonizing, a culmination of 5 years of suppressed biology. Victor took care of me. There was no hesitation, no holding back. In the heavy shadowed privacy of his estate, amidst tangled sheets and the overwhelming collision of our scents, he proved exactly what kind of alpha he was. He was dominant, yes, but he demanded my strength in return. He wanted me fighting back, clawing at his shoulders, matching his feral energy. On the 3rd night of the cycle, as I lay panting beneath him, completely stripped of every defense I had ever known, Victor pressed his lips against my pulse point. "Mine," he growled against my skin, his eyes glowing with an ancient primal need. "Let me claim you, Leo. Let me show the world exactly who you belong to." "Do it," I gasped, arching my neck, offering him the very thing I had denied everyone else for 5 years. Victor's fangs sank into my scent gland. The pain was a sharp, blinding flash of white light, instantly swallowed by a rush of pure, euphoric warmth. The bond snapped into place, heavy, secure, and unbreakable. I was marked, claimed by the most ruthless alpha in the city, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect, because 3 weeks later, the annual Global Tech and Finance Summit was being held. And for the first time in 5 years, I was going to be in the same room as Damien Harrington. The Global Tech and Finance Summit was the crown jewel of the corporate calendar held that year in the sprawling gilded ballrooms of the Waldorf Astoria in New York. The guest list was a who's who of global economic powerhouses, executives from BlackRock and titans of industry. 5 years ago, I would have been sprinting through the service corridors of a venue like this, frantically coordinating Damien's talking points, smoothing his lapels and suppressing my own scent so as not to offend the delicate sensibilities of the conservative board members. Tonight, I was the main event. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in our penthouse suite, adjusting the cuffs of a custom-tailored, midnight blue Tom Ford suit. The silk caught the ambient light, framing a silhouette that was sharp, commanding, and unapologetic. But the most important accessory I wore wasn't woven from silk or wool. It was the jagged, deeply bruised claiming mark resting high on my collarbone, stark and impossible to miss against my pale skin. I had intentionally left the top 2 buttons of my shirt undone. For the first time in 5 years, my bloodstream was completely free of inhibitors. My scent a potent, swirling storm of sharp, cedar-heavy rain, and the distinct possessive ozone of my alpha filled the room. Victor stepped up behind me, his reflection joining mine in the glass. He was wearing a classic black tuxedo, looking every inch the predatory monarch of the corporate underworld. He didn't say a word, simply resting his heavy hands on my hips, leaning down to press a proprietary kiss directly over the mark he had given me. A jolt of pure heat shot down my spine, my inner omega, purring with deep, absolute satisfaction. "You look like a weapon," Victor murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "I am a weapon," I replied softly, meeting his intense grey eyes in the mirror. "Are you ready to watch an empire burn?" "Lead the way, little storm," he said, offering me his arm. When we stepped out of the private elevator and into the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, the sheer opulence was almost blinding. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, casting fractured rainbows across the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. A string quartet played a delicate classical piece in the corner, almost entirely drowned out by the low humming roar of networking billionaires. The moment we crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just Victor's notoriously reclusive presence drawing stares. It was the heavy territorial wave of our combined scents rolling through the room. Alphas subtly shifted their stances, instinctively recognizing a dominant predator in their midst, while Omegas glanced over with a mixture of awe and jealousy. It didn't take long to spot him. Damien Harrington was holding court near a towering champagne pyramid, flanked by several executives from BlackRock. He looked older, the lines of stress deeply etched around his eyes. His posture, once effortlessly arrogant, now held a rigid defensive tension. Beside him stood Caleb Montgomery. Caleb was undeniably beautiful, wearing a pale blush suit that matched his delicate peach blossom scent. But as he smiled vacantly at a joke an executive made, looking completely disconnected from the heavy financial discourse happening around him, he looked exactly like what he was, an expensive, fragile ornament. I accepted a flute of champagne from a passing waiter, my hand perfectly steady. "There he is." Victor's gaze locked onto Damien, his jaw tightening. "He looks exhausted. The European logistics failure last quarter hit them harder than they publicly disclosed." "Let's go say hello," I said, a dangerous smile touching my lips. As we approached, the crowd naturally parted for Victor. Damien, mid-sentence about quarterly projections, glanced up. His eyes widened first in shock at seeing the notoriously elusive Victor attending a public gala, and then in absolute, unadulterated horror as his gaze shifted to me. "Leo," Damien whispered, his voice cracking entirely, forgetting the executives surrounding him. His eyes swept over me, taking in the expensive suit, the confident posture, and the undeniable fact that I was standing shoulder to shoulder with the man actively dismantling his legacy. Then the realization hit him. The scent. He inhaled, his alpha instincts flaring as he recognized the sharp cedar and rain he used to rely on, but it was inextricably tangled with the terrifying, suffocating ozone of his greatest rival. His gaze snapped to my neck, all the color drained from Damien's face. He stared at the fresh, permanent bite mark on my collarbone, as if looking at a ghost. "Good evening, Damien," I said, my voice smooth, carrying no trace of the broken 24-year-old he had discarded. "It's been a while. I see you're still pushing the European expansion despite the 14% drop in supply chain efficiency. A bold strategy." Damien opened and closed his mouth like a fish completely derailed. What are you doing here?" "You're with him." Caleb, sensing his alpha's sudden distress, stepped closer, his vanilla scent spiking with anxiety. "Damien, darling, who is this?" "I'm his former fixer," I said smoothly, not breaking eye contact with Damien. "And currently, I am the Chief Strategy Officer and partner at Victor's firm." Victor stepped slightly in front of me, a protective, highly dominant maneuver that made Damien flinch. "Leo has been instrumental in our recent acquisitions, Harrington, including the successful buyout of your primary lithium supplier last Tuesday. I believe your manufacturing division is currently scrambling to find a replacement." Damien looked physically ill. The executives around him were now watching the exchange with rapt, predatory attention. Blood in the water. You engineered the lithium buyout." Damien choked out, staring at me, as the financial reality of the last 6 months crashed down on him. Every roadblock, every outmaneuvered deal, every lost contract, it hadn't just been Victor's brute force. It had been my intimate, surgical knowledge of Harrington Industries' weaknesses. "I told you 5 years ago, Damien," I said softly, stepping closer, so only he could hear. "I don't yield. You traded a partner for a porcelain doll, and you left your blind spots completely exposed." I didn't wait for a response. I simply turned Victor's hand, settling warmly on the small of my back, and walked away, leaving Damien Harrington choking on the ashes of his own hubris. The destruction of Harrington Industries wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a meticulously choreographed demolition. Following the summit at the Waldorf Astoria, the financial press had a field day. The rumors of Damien's incompetence, paired with Victor's aggressive market expansion, caused Harrington's stock to enter a free fall. Institutional investors, including the heavyweights at BlackRock, began quietly divesting. For 3 months, I worked from the massive command center in Victor's estate, barely sleeping, fueled by the brilliant, intoxicating synergy of our bond. Victor never once asked me to tone down my aggression. When I pitched strategies that bordered on draconian, he didn't balk. He smiled, his chest vibrating with a deep, approving rumble, and handed me the resources to execute them. The final blow came on a crisp Tuesday morning in November. Victor and I walked into the glass-walled boardroom of Harrington Industries. We didn't have an appointment, but we didn't need one. We held the keys to the castle. Damien was seated at the head of the long mahogany table, looking like a hollowed-out shell of the man I once knew. His suit hung loosely on his frame. The board of directors, the same rigid traditionalists who had once deemed me unfit to be the face of their company, sat frozen in a state of collective panic. What is the meaning of this the chairman of the board demanded, standing up. Security is supposed to be barring unauthorized personnel. I didn't blink. I simply opened my leather briefcase and slid a thick bound document down the polished length of the table. It stopped perfectly in front of the chairman. "We aren't unauthorized," Victor stated, his voice ringing with absolute crushing authority. He pulled out a chair for me, waiting for me to sit, before he stood directly behind me, a silent, lethal sentinel. I steepled my fingers, looking down the table at the men who had orchestrated my exile. As of 8 a.m. this morning, Victor's conglomerate has successfully completed a hostile takeover of Harrington Industries. Through a series of proxy votes and private acquisitions from your departing shareholders, we now control a 54% majority stake in this company. Silence descended on the room, thick and suffocating. Damien buried his face in his hands. The terms of the restructuring are non-negotiable. I continued, projecting my voice with lethal calm. Majority shareholder acquisition, complete operational control, transfers to Victor's holding company immediately. Asset liquidation. The failing European branches will be dismantled and sold for parts by the end of the fiscal quarter. Executive cleansing. The immediate termination of the current CEO Damien Harrington, without severance or a golden parachute. Board dissolution. Every board member sitting in this room is forcibly retired, effective immediately. "You can't do this," Damien whispered, finally lifting his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, desperately seeking mine. "Leo, please. This is my family's legacy. This is what my grandfather built. You know what this company means to me. I know exactly what it means to you, Damien. It meant more to you than loyalty. It meant more to you than 3 years of devotion. You built your glass house, and now you're angry that someone threw a stone." "Leo," Damien pleaded, ignoring the shocked gasps of his board members. He sounded utterly pathetic, stripped of all alpha pride. "I made a mistake. I was young. I was pressured by my father. Caleb is leaving me. The moment the money started drying up, he filed for separation. I have nothing left. Please, you were the only one who ever truly understood me." I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no residual heartbreak, no pity. Just a cold, clinical detachment. I could feel Victor's possessive growl vibrating in the air, a warning to Damien to watch his tone, but I reached back, resting my hand on Victor's thigh, to soothe him. My alpha quieted instantly, trusting me to handle my own ghosts. "I understood you perfectly, Damien," I replied, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "That is precisely why I knew exactly how to dismantle you. You are terminated. Security will escort you from the premises in 10 minutes. I suggest you pack quickly." I didn't wait to watch him pack. Victor and I turned our backs on the ruined empire and walked out of the boardroom. The air outside the Harrington building was freezing, but as we stepped onto the bustling New York pavement, I took a deep, unrestrained breath. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for 5 long years was finally permanently gone. I had walked out of this very building at 24, stripped of my dignity and discarded like trash. I was walking out at 29 as a conqueror, holding the deed to the city. Victor pulled me into the shadow of our waiting town car, pressing me back against the door. He didn't care about the pedestrians walking by. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling the deep, satisfying scent of my triumph, his teeth lightly grazing over the scarred tissue of my claiming mark. "Brilliant," Victor breathed against my skin, his eyes fiercely proud. "Absolutely terrifying and completely brilliant. Are you satisfied, my storm?" I reached up, tangling my fingers in his hair, pulling him down for a bruising, unapologetic kiss. I felt the powerful, steady thrum of our bond, a partnership built not on submission, but on mutual destruction and respect. I smiled, the taste of victory sweet on my tongue. Now let's go home. We have an empire to run. Did Leo's ruthless revenge satisfy your craving for intense Omegaverse drama? If you loved this story of betrayal, corporate power, and an alpha who truly values his partner's brilliant mind, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow audio drama lovers and subscribe to our channel for more satisfying stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a thrilling new upload. Thank you so much for listening to our amazing channel today.